Data management under pressure. Is your company culture a help or a hindrance? That's the topic. My book is primarily about leadership and its relationship to company culture. That is my passion. My basic premise is that 90% of your problems are in your culture. Whether it's data management or whatever it is you're doing, whatever area of work you're in, 90% of your problems could be fixed if you could fix your culture. Obviously our industry is in a crisis. I'm not sure that there's less pressure in the crisis any more than there was when oil was $100 a barrel, because there's a lot of pressure when the money's good, right? So I don't know that there's a huge difference there. So let's talk about crisis. My personal opinion is crisis is the original great disruptor, and if you know, disruption is really in vogue right now. But we should embrace it as a necessary catalyst for significant change, and that really could be personally or it could really be professionally. Crisis does things for us. It tends to show us things we wouldn't see, right? When things are going good, whatever, we're just like, where everything's great. Crisis hits and it tends to make us look at things differently. It helps us deal with realities we tend to pass over. And it shows us our weaknesses and our strengths. So if we're in a good crisis, let's make good use of it, right? So we live in a very complex and competitive world. I think that hands down, nobody argue with that. Unfortunately, because of that, a lot of pressures, and those pressures can lead to unethical actions, which can affect us all. And that makes for an unlevel playing field. I don't know if you remember WorldCom back in Tulsa years ago, and they were skewing their numbers. And I remember reading an article about one of their competitors who said, I couldn't figure out how to beat these guys, right? And the problem was they were cheating. That's why he couldn't beat them. But he was under a lot of pressure from his boss to beat them, but they were being unethical. It's kind of like wrestling a guy and you had your Wheaties, but he's on steroids, right? It's just not a fair playing field. So unethical actions affect us all. And this isn't really a talk about ethics, but honestly, pressures tend to create unethical actions, as we'll see. So pressures from many different sources, what can we control? I mean, really, honestly, that's what we should look. There's a lot of things outside of our control, right? We can't control politics completely. We can have some influence through our voting or whatever. We can't control regulations. But what can we control? What can we control within our sphere to deal with pressures? And are we willing to take an honest look at ourselves and our culture? I think that when I talk to people about business and I see things going on in the business, I say, you could solve a lot of your problems if you just get honest with yourself about what's really going on. And I don't know what it is about human nature that just doesn't want to just look at things and honestly with ourselves or whatever, but that's a good place to start. So is your company culture a help or a hindrance? Well, there's really no neutrality from my view, right? It's either helping or it's hindering, and maybe it's a blend of the two, but it's not doing anything, right? I mean, it's not unconsequential. It's influencing something in your business or in your workspace or your workplace. Often, though, it's the last place we look for problems. If we're trying to solve something, it's like, why isn't this working? We tend to make it the last place that we look. And we underrate its influence on performance and productivity. I mean, honestly, you all have been around long enough. You know how a business culture can affect your performance and your productivity. And a lot of times we say, I don't have a culture problem, I have a people problem. But honestly, I have my tendency to say you have a culture problem more than you have a people problem. In fact, you'd be surprised that when you get the culture right, all of a sudden you have the right people with you. And some of it is that good people will stay in cultures. I mean, your star players will stay in a good culture. But at the same time, your average people in a great culture will actually come up. Their performance and productivity will come up. So I'm going to look at two case studies today, two different scenarios, but they had the same thing in common. And the first thing they have in common is the C-suite denies any knowledge of the activity. Now, that's pretty common if you kind of just look through history. I even remember CFS back in Tulsa, where the owner says, you know, his partner basically created this dummy company, and he didn't know anything about it. And then in GM, we'll look at GM, it's one of the case studies, and VW, but that's one thing they all have in common. Now, the first thought is to be suspicious about that, right? How's that possible? But honestly, I think it's true, and I'll tell you why. Because I think it speaks to how dysfunctional the culture is. Because the C-suite is either isolated, there's a bubble, or there's no feedback, they're not allowing any feedback or whatever. So honestly, I don't have any issues. They probably don't really know what's going on. But I feel kind of like the congresswoman when she was interviewing the CEO from GM, and when she said, well, I don't know anything. And the congresswoman says, well, I'm not exactly encouraged by that, right? So that's kind of how the way I feel. The other thing that we'll see is that they came to the same conclusion, and that's to fix the culture. So the first one was VW crisis, and what I did is I pulled out a few just comments out of articles, and I won't insult you by reading the whole thing, but I did, as you can see, highlighted a few areas. So really what happened at VW is they introduced software that they installed in their cars, and maybe y'all have been reading about that, it's just pretty current, that's why I chose it. Basically to falsify the emission records whenever the car was being tested. And the reason they did is because there was no way for their engines to meet the U.S. emission standards within the required time frame or the budget. So they basically just they're fraudulent, right? Now let's look at some of really what was going on at Volkswagen. One of the things is Winterkorn, who was the CEO at the time, wanted to make VW the world's biggest car maker. And the one market that they had not done that in is US. And so that was his goal, was to make VW the biggest car maker in the United States. Well, the group almost doubled their global annual sales, and they actually beat Toyota marginally at some point. But here's what one former sales executive said. He said, because of basically the target, the pressure went way up. And if you didn't like it, then you either moved of your own accord or your performance managed out of the business. So, a lot of pressure there. Like many chief executives, Martin Winterkorn was a demanding boss who didn't like failure. I mean, I've worked for a few of those. So there was an unusual amount of pressure, and he doesn't really find it here, but there's an unusual amount of pressure from the CEO. Now, just before I go any further, I'm not picking on anybody. I'm just trying to illustrate something that creates pressure and how there's a relationship between leadership and culture. So it was also said of him there was also a distance, a fear, respect. If you presented bad news, those were the moments that you could become quite unpleasant, loud, and quite demeaning. So when you have somebody like that, and again, I'm not picking on him, is that when you have somebody who's, if you bring them bad news or bad feedback and you get pushback, what is your tendency? Stop coming, or stop talking, right? Or stop bringing that information. So VW leadership style was driving this business upward, right? They were achieving these extraordinary goals, even though the pressure was high, but they were actually getting the job done. But the same leadership style creates a culture where the engineers, because of the pressure, falsify data in order to meet the demand, right? So you can see the relationship between leadership driving these aggressive goals, but also driving the culture to the point where somebody felt like they had to do something unethical to meet the demands of this pressure. All right, y'all with me? So then the business implodes from the inside out. Next case study is the GM recall crisis. And if you read about this in 2014, they had a faulty ignition switch in the Cobalt, which was disabling the airbag whenever it shut off. And so this went resolved for over a decade. Could you imagine? They couldn't resolve this within 10 years? I mean, that's some serious dysfunction, right? Wouldn't you agree? So anyway, GM conducted their own internal investigation, which they produced a 325-page report. Now, if you like that kind of stuff, I would recommend reading the report. It's actually very interesting. But they start talking about culture about page 250, so if you want to just jump right to that, you can kind of read that part of it. But one of the things that they noted is that there was this resistance or reluctance to raise issues in the culture. Right? It's the same kind of thing. There was some pressure, there was something there, either they got pushed back, that they just stopped giving feedback. Some witnesses provide examples where the culture, atmosphere, and the response of supervisors discourage individuals from raising safety concerns. Now, could you imagine a car maker responsible for millions of lives, that they had something in their culture that was not allowing people to bring up safety issues? So, culture issue, culture problem. This one, my favorite, says supervisors warn employees never to put anything above the company or never put the company at risk. And we've all heard that. Right? In fact, they even received some formal training on how to write about safety issues. So they were warned, or they were told, well, actually warned, to write smart and not use judgmental adjectives or speculation. Right? So really what they're doing is they're telling them, okay, this is the only way you can describe this. So they were given a number of words to avoid with suggested replacements. So like, you couldn't say problem. You couldn't say we have a problem. We have an issue, or we have a condition, or we have a matter, right? So what are they doing? They're basically discouraging honest feedback. That's what they're doing. They couldn't say safety. They had to say has potential safety implications. They couldn't say defect, does not perform to design. So 4 issues with the GM, if you look through the case study. One was accountability, or the lack of accountability. This issue passed through an astonishing number of committees, so it's not like nobody ever talked about it. But they could never determine the identity of any actual decision maker. In fact, they said it was impenetrable. I'm sorry I didn't say that very well. But they couldn't even find someone to make a decision in the GM culture. And again, no single person would even own any decision. You know, if you have a culture where people are afraid to give feedback, well, guess what else they're not going to do? They're not going to own anything, right? It's too risky. It's too risky. There was something in the GM culture called the GM nod. And basically, if you were in a meeting, you say, hey, we got this issue, our ignition switch is not working, and the airbag's not imploding, and they would say, like, we'll take care of it. And then nothing would get done. And actually, the CEO said it was an idiomatic recognition of a culture that did not move quickly, or did not move issues forward quickly. So what were they having? What was the communication? That was the second thing. So they were having information disconnect. Now you all are data management, right? So you're what? You're in control of the information. You're in control of the data that you're giving to other people to get their job done. So in their culture, they have this information. If you have an information disconnect in your culture, what is happening? Your business is breaking down. People aren't getting accurate data. They're getting incomplete data. And so where's that going to cause problems down the road, or delivering on whatever service or product you have? You know, communication is more than just an exchange of information, right? Typically we think about, if I'm having a conversation, you're giving me information, I'm giving you. It's really an exchange of perspective. Especially in a work scenario, if I'm talking about what you're doing, I need to know what I'm doing and how it affects you, right? How many of you have something come to your desk and you like this person has no idea what I do because this is impacting me in a very negative way, right? So that's an information disconnect. Okay, I have information, but it's not what I need, or it's inaccurate, it's incomplete, all right? So there's a disconnect there. And the other guy's thinking, yeah, I got him his information. What's the problem? Well, one is they don't understand work from another's point of view. That's really communication, is understanding what the other person does from their point of view, right? That makes for a good culture. And to be better able to get them the data that they need. If we know what they're doing, if we understand what they're doing, if we have the perspective that they have, then I can get them the data that they need to get their job done. The third issue was the inability to identify the problem. All right, this thing went for 10 years. So they couldn't really identify the problem. Some of it was because there was an information disconnect. There was no accountability. So they couldn't get anybody to own it. They couldn't get really communication going to solve it. So really, without those two things, it's near impossible to identify the problem, right? So accountability, communication, two big culture things. Here's something else, conflicting values. I think this was really a big one. This is something that came out in the report as two somewhat different directives from the top. When safety is an issue, cost is irrelevant, and then cost is everything, right? Do you see the conflicting values? Right? And a lot of things in culture, the reason there's a disconnect is because there's conflicting value, or conflicting values. So in this particular instance, it was safety and cost. So for GM, 2000 was a time of extraordinary cost cutting. As you know, they ended up filing bankruptcy and had a bailout. So there's a lot of pressure in the culture related to cost. And we all know that one, right? I mean, cost is always, pressure is like cholesterol, right? There's good pressure, there's bad pressure. Right? Good pressure is good because we all need a little bit of pressure to keep us going, deadlines or whatever, but there's also bad pressure as well. So again, the message they heard from the top leadership, we heard repeatedly from GM personnel about the focus on cost cutting and the problems it caused in the whole culture. See what I'm doing, timer. Anyway, one of the things that was interesting is that those responsible for a vehicle were responsible for its cost. Okay, that seemed normal, right? But the problem is if they incurred a cost that affected a vehicle they weren't working on, then they become responsible for the cost for those other vehicles, right? So not just the vehicle they were working on. So if that was you, what would be your tendency? Your tendency is like, well, if I bring this issue up and I create a cost for that issue and it affects other vehicles, then somebody's going to be in my face about why are you costing us so much money, right? And so what happens? You become risk aversive. I mean, by nature, it's like, I'm not going to say that because it's going to end up in my face on my desk. I'm going to be, at risk of losing my job or whatever. So again, conflict of values. Let's look at the actual cost of GM crisis, since there was so much emphasis on cost. What did it actually cost them on the back end? Well, there's $900 million to settle the criminal charges related to its flawed ignition. That's a pretty good chunk of money. Most companies couldn't even survive that. Fortunately, GM was big enough, they are actually surviving. It was tied to at least 124 deaths, millions of recalls, $4.1 billion in repairs. So where were the greater costs, right? Where was the money saving, right? They're doing all these things to save money on the front end, but what did it end up costing them on the back end? All right, so when you feel the need for speed, right? When oil is $100 a barrel, everybody is flying fast and furious. So we have project demand and project delivery. Those are the two things. So what are we putting at risk between those things through our culture, but what we're doing, what we're kind of values that we have in our culture? What are we putting at risk? These are things: quality, communication. These are potentially at risk. Evaluation, analytics, work-life balance, integrity. These are things that are at risk in between those things if we don't have the right values. So when those things are sacrificed, then demand becomes to impede delivery, right? So delivery cannot meet demand because the pressure to keep costs low conflict with the demand, right? So if you have a deadline you're meeting, but somebody's saying, well, you can only hire 2 people and you really need 10 people, well, that gets a lot, let's say 4 people, then what's happening? Well, you're impeding a delivery because of a cost reason. And so it's like it becomes a conflict, it becomes a pressure. It's like, how can I get this done with 2 people? So then the focus becomes on the failure to deliver rather than on the actual values at risk because of the demand, right? What were those values? Quality, communication. Putting those things at risk, we focus on the failure that, well, it didn't deliver, and we forget about the things that are being affected otherwise, the other risk. So in a fear-based culture, a failure-aversive culture, people will consciously or unconsciously avoid risk. This is a quote from Creativity Inc. And that's what happens is people shut down. It's like, I'm not going to risk my job. I'm not going to risk somebody being in my face by being honest and, hey, we got an issue, but if I'm getting kickback or pushback, then I'm going to be reluctant to bring that up. So disconnects between delivery and demand is silence, feedback, failure to resolve real problems, and even, as in VW's case, set up for possible unethical behaviors. And here was the VW conclusion, that culture matters. We need, in the future, a climate in which problems aren't hidden, they're openly communicated, and a culture where it's possible and permissible to argue with your superior about the best way to go. He talks about just making changes where managers are often silenced, but having open communication. Again, GM's conclusion was the same thing. And this, I couldn't say this better, so we'll just go through this. A successful overhaul of processes becomes with the examination of organizational structure, with influence of the degree of coordination between groups, with interrelated responsibilities and the extent emphasis the company places on key priorities, including safety. So really, for them, they both identified that the problem was in the culture. The culture needed to be fixed. So what drives culture? And this is really where I've been heading. And I appreciate your patience kind of weeding through some of that. But values drive culture, right? And leadership drives values. And that's really the point of why I kind of picked on Mr. Winterkorn. It's because his values, his leadership style, which really represented values, was driving that culture, those values. And then company culture is really driving the business. This is a great quote. Performance more often comes down to a cultural challenge rather than a simple technical one. Culture is a reflection of values. I could walk into your culture without even meeting your leader and spend some time there, and I could determine the values of your leader. Like, are people valued? Is innovation valued? Is trust valued? Is open communication valued? Is culture valued? So, what drives culture? The importance of values is core values are so critical to a healthy culture. All right? And so when you create core values, then those core values really are into the leadership, and you have this consistency based around core values. And a lot of times what I see is that different leaders are hired and they have sort of varying values, right? Like one guy may think that you need to be working 80 hours a week. This guy may, people have families, maybe they only need to be working 45, 50 hours a week. Right? So what happens if you don't have core values, you have these sort of rogue leaders with values, driving the culture, and it's just different all over the place. Right? So there's no continuity, there's no consensus. So core values brings a unifying consensus to leaders and how they operate, and it brings a greater unity to the culture. So the importance of core values should act as a safeguard against poor actions. Right? Core values should be used as a means to resolve conflict. A lot of times resolve conflict based on personality or bias or whatever, but you can use core values to resolve conflict effectively. Right? It gives you a grid, it gives you a consensus. Core values must be reflected in behavioral values, right? Like if you remember Enron, one of their core values was integrity. Well, I would say that was a fail, right? Because their behavioral values didn't reflect their core values. Right? Core values really don't mean anything unless it's impacting behavior. I think that's fair. Core values should ensure right priorities. So in GM's example, right, safety was the right priority. Now, cost was important, but it shouldn't have superseded safety, right? So the core values should ensure that priorities are right. That safety should always be before cost. So collaboration is the foundation of great culture, and I have one of my chapters of my book is named this. Both companies came to the same conclusion: create a more collaborative culture. Right? The goal is to eliminate disconnects where people, data, and the process break down by creating a more collaborative business model. I'm trying to move a little faster here. So in a collaborative culture, conversations extend to all organizational levels. Right? This is huge. Now we've got to get conversations out of pockets and get it. And if you look at like Google, the technology companies, they're doing this. They're creating a more open culture where there's open communication, even if it's not all positive, right? Even if it happens to be negative or bad news, right? There's more shared information because nobody's like, you know, like this is mine and that's yours and you can't have mine, right? There's none of that. It's based in mutual trust and respect. And there's a platform for honest dialogue. I mean, that is huge. Really, as I said early, if you just change one thing in your culture, in your business, create a platform for honest dialogue. Just to be honest about what's wrong, what's not working, right? And then eliminate fear-based pressure. So value, again, of collaborative culture, there's improved communication. We're better connected. Or we should have at least the opportunity to be better connected. Increased accountability. There's a quicker consensus. I mean, that was, you know, again, GM. They could not come to consensus to get the problem resolved. More productive workforce, and you're going to have much more controlled costs. So you're going to actually resolve your cost problem in a more collaborative culture because you're eliminating those disconnects that cost money. Now, just a few notes for personalities, leadership styles who feel they are indispensable. Collaboration is a struggle. Just, you know, because people, if you have, I'm not picking on anybody, but if people have a domineering personality, it's very difficult for them to be collaborative because they want to dominate. And that's really some of the issues with the control command type leadership style. But it can be a struggle. The great thing about collaboration is no one person is indispensable. In fact, everybody is important. Everybody is valued, right? So if everyone's valued, then what? Everyone delivers, right? Like do you deliver better when you're valued or if you're being devalued? So, conclusion, the collaborative culture is not the easier road. I will just tell you that, it's not. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to have open communication, to be collaborative, to kind of lay down your ego sometimes or not want to, you know, dominate everything. But it's definitely the better one. Now I just put this in here for kind of for fun because I thought, you know, data best practices is we like, you know, it's better integrated, it's better relational, it's better when data communicates, when there's analytics, integrity. I thought, you know, that's the best practices for a culture. To be integrated, which is really what collaboration is. We're just better integrated. We're better relational because we're not have those communication information disconnects. We're communicating better. There's accountability and there's integrity. So takeaways. So what we are seeing is long-standing companies with the control and command authoritarian leadership styles imploding. And the crisis is forcing a change, not, and I prefer another model, but we must make a change if we are going to go forward. And this is really what VW and GM both came to that conclusion. If we're going to go forward, we're going to make a change in our culture. So whether you're managing data or people, you must identify those cultural disconnects and determine how those disconnects are impacting your process, because they are. Those disconnects, your cultural disconnects are impacting your process. So have consistent, honest, collaborative conversations about how to fix it and how we can get better. A collaborative culture is your best competitive advantage. You know, everybody has access to technology, and maybe if your company has more money, they could buy better technology, but really your competitive edge is in your ability to create a collaborative culture, a team. I mean, really that's what's going to give you the competitive edge.